Hello there guys, welcome back to the channel, welcome back for another video. I hope you are having a great weekend wherever it is you are. Now today we've got two articles that we're going to be looking into. The first one concerns the sales of Final Fantasy 16 and the second is going to be looking at game preservation and the danger that it faces. So first of all, let's touch on Final Fantasy 16. This is brought to us by an article via IGN, where Square defended the commercial reception of Final Fantasy 16 after many people feel that it has performed quite poorly. Now, the debate surrounding the success of Final Fantasy 16 comes largely down to a Bloomberg article that stated the series was losing momentum and highlighted its poor sales in Japan during its second week. For reference, in its first week, the game sold 3 million units, as compared to Final Fantasy VII Remake, which sold 3.5 million, and Final Fantasy 15, which in its first day alone sold 5 million units, which to this day remains the fastest selling in the franchise. Now on the surface this doesn't look too good, but Square came out all guns blazing and stated that in terms of its potential market, it's actually a success. Because the game is a PS5 exclusive, they argue that the actual user base of the people who own a PS5 is significantly lower than when they released Final Fantasy VII Remake, for example. So in terms of their proportion of sales, the actual hit rate of owner to the sale of the game, it's actually done better than other titles. Now a commenter in the article actually broke down these percentages. Final Fantasy 16 sold 3 million units with a potential user base of 38 million who own a PS5. That converts into a 7.8% buy rate. The Final Fantasy VII Remake sold 3.5 million on a 110 million PS4 install base at the time of launch. That converts to around about 3.2%. And finally, Final Fantasy 15, which sold 5 million in its first day, had an install base of around 75 million, because the game came out on both the PS4 and the Xbox One, extending its reach, which converted to around about 6.6% buy rate. So these percentages suggest that the game has actually been a success in terms of the market it can tap into, and this is likely only going to get better when the game gets its PC port, which is rumoured as being worked on even as we speak. Now, some analysts decided to look into this, in particular the poor sales in Japan, and some of them stated that this was mostly to be expected. First of all, there's the dominance of the Nintendo Switch in Japan as compared to the PS5. The Switch has obviously been out for a lot longer in Japan and has been able to establish dominance. There's also the different way of life in Japan, the work culture, so having a console on the go helps a lot more than having a home console which barely you'll be able to play. The other reason why it was touted as having poor reception in Japan came down to its more mature story and its older characters. Analyst Louise Woolridge argued that Japanese players generally favour younger protagonists while the West is the opposite. And to back up her claim, she pointed to the 2010 release of the original Nier. Of course, Japan got Nier Replicants, which featured a younger protagonist, and then this of course was re-released in 2021. But then in the West, we got an older looking protagonist, a more fatherly figure in Nier Gestalt, because of course the Japanese developers felt that Western audiences resonated more with older protagonists. So even now that might still hold true. But arguably the biggest reason why this isn't much of a surprise, and probably isn't too much of a concern to Square as well, is that we've known since 2022, mid-2022, that Square are looking to move away from the Japanese market, mostly spurred by rising development costs. This came via an article via Glitched in October 2022. Via Square Enix's annual reports, they stated, "Achieving major growth in the game industry is difficult now for companies that compete primarily in the Japanese market given its greying demographics. As such, it is critical for our business that we produce hit titles that speak to the global markets, which offers greater scale in terms of both customers and sales volumes." In a follow-up, they also stated that, in other words, the Japanese market is no longer sufficient for achieving a level of earning that enables us to recoup our development investment and generate a profit, and we therefore need to approach development efforts based on the assumption that we have to succeed in a global market. Now, Square did mention development costs, but you have to think as well that maybe another reason why they've shifted this focus is the success of their MMORPG Final Fantasy XIV. The game recently became the most successful title in the Final Fantasy franchise, and that was spurred heavily by the mass exodus of players from World of Warcraft following the issues surrounding Activision Blizzard. With that and the recent release of its expansion Endwalker, the game is one of the most popular MMOs around even today, and it also has that romantic story in that it effectively rose from the ashes, it was rebuilt from the ground up, so everyone enjoys a redemption story, and then on top of that there's the goodwill between the player base and the developers as well. The developers put a lot of events on, they do listen to the fans, and there's a lot of goodwill between them as a result of that. And of course, because Final Fantasy XIV focuses on a worldwide market, of course Square are going to try to emulate that with their newer releases, which is why they've changed up the design style of Final Fantasy XVI. But what do you guys think? Do you think Final Fantasy XVI has performed poorly? Do you think it made the wrong decision in terms of game design? Let us know in the comments and I guess time will tell. Now our next story concerns game preservation. This article came from Insider Gaming, where it was stated that 87% of classic titles from before 2010 are completely unavailable. This sample size consisted of around 4,000 games and they were categorised into abandoned, neglected or active. Now there were some key findings from the research. First of all, the PS2, the most successful console of all time, only 12% of its entire catalogue survives to this day. Another one is that when the 3DS and Wii U storefront closed, there were over 1,000 unique titles that no longer existed, and there was also a call for the outdated US copyright laws to be changed as they prevent companies from working on their preservation practices. Now these findings are pretty crazy and quite alarming in many cases as well. Almost 1 in 10 titles from before 2010 no longer available. But why is preservation so important in this day and age? Well, as physical media becomes ever more scarce and we move to more subscription-based models, preservation of older titles allows us at least first of all to look into the history of games. They allow us to see the evolution of titles from their foundation to how they exist now. In terms of RPGs, you think of the likes of Hydlide and Dragon Slayer and how their game design was later refined in The Legend of Zelda, which of course is now one of the biggest franchises of all time. And then there's preference as well. Some players prefer the older titles. They feel that the gameplay is superior to what they have now, or that the experiences from the olden days are just more complete. I mean, you look at modern games nowadays, many of them get volumes of DLC added on, or in some cases they are completely broken when they're released. Case in point, the likes of Cyberpunk 2077, and I guess you could also point to the release of Trails into Reverie very recently, which had a few notable bugs related to its gameplay, which are still being worked on to be patched out. And of course the study also brought up copyright laws, which yes, in this day and age are not just a blanket litigation to deal with the problem. The landscape has evolved, it's shifted considerably since they were first introduced. They are no longer fit for purpose in the present age. But even with that, video game companies like Nintendo stick very rigidly to the laws. And if we're going to use Nintendo as an example, they are infamous for cracking down on the likes of fan projects or anything related to emulation. Very recently, in fact, Nintendo issued a DMCA takedown on a work-in-progress emulator. This came from an article by XDA back in May this year. Now don't get me wrong, protecting your intellectual property is all well and good, but there has to be a line drawn here, because if you can't offer the means to purchase them through legitimate channels, then the player base are forced to step in, especially with scarcity of classic titles leading to obscene prices. If we're using Nintendo as an example, look at Fire Emblem Path of Radiance on the GameCube. Good luck getting any price below $200 for a complete in-box set. And of course last week we talked about the original .hack tetralogy, where CyberConnect 2 reiterated that they wanted to remaster or remake these games, but the decision largely came down to Bandai Namco. And because it's not possible to play these games on anything except the original hardware, the actual price of the games has shot up, especially for the fourth game in the series. Now surely in this day and age it wouldn't be too difficult for a company, especially with hardware capabilities in this day and age, to create legitimate emulation platforms. In my opinion at the very least, I think if you offer a subscription-based service similar to say Xbox Game Pass with a database of all of the classic titles, it'll perform quite well. But obviously the companies don't feel there is a return there, which I really can't understand. If anything, I feel that this is a limitless market. And I say that because we're always looking to relive our childhood days. Nostalgia hits everyone. I don't think there's anyone in this world who doesn't look back at the so-called good old days, and gaming is no exception there. So in other words, the market here is potentially limitless. All I can deduce is that the companies don't want to do this because it might take away from their newer releases that they depend on. Some people will be more than happy to just play older titles and thus forget about the newer releases in lieu of an endless supply of classics. And of course that's not going to work in a company's favour where they need to maximise their returns as much as possible, especially with the rising cost of development. It's come to a sad conclusion that nowadays we celebrate remasters. And don't get me wrong, remasters are a good thing because accessibility is always a good thing, but we should never be in a position whereby praise is given for something like this. This should just be standard practice. From my own personal experience, I got into gaming because of my stepdad. He showed me the games he used to play, and I dare say 20 years on, the games we play now will act as inspiration to the next generation of gamers. History and legacy is important. It's not something to be ashamed of nor erased. But the way things are going, 20 years from now, we will see many of the games in the present day fall by the wayside, much like what is happening now, unless something changes. But what do you guys think? Is this a worrying trend for game preservation? Do you think that companies need to do more? Let us know in the comments below. But that is all we are going to be covering today, guys. I hope you have a great weekend, and I'll see you again next week.